Thank you for coming. I am Meg Tyler, Chair of the Institute for the Study of Irish Culture and Associate Professor of Humanities at BU. This evening's event is part of a series of readings by and conversations with Irish writers, politicians, and historians. Next week, on April 25th, we'll hear from the Irish historian and journalist Tim Pat Coogan, who will read from his book, The Famine Plot, England's Role in Ireland's Greatest Tragedy. Tonight's event has been generously co-sponsored by the BU Centre for the Humanities, the Centre for the Study of Europe, AGNI, the Poetry Series, and the Department of Creative Writing. We owe our gratitude to Professor Vivian Schmidt, Director of the Centre for the Study of Europe, Elizabeth Amrian, Joe Rezick, Bill Pierce, and Sven Burkerts, among others. The Irish Voices series is funded in part through a grant from the European Commission delegation in Washington, D.C. We're grateful to the Commission for their support of this initiative. This is the third of 3 literary events in the Irish Voices series. The first featured Colm Tóibín, whose reading and conversation with Christopher Ricks acted as a memorable inaugural occasion for the Institute for the Study of Irish Culture. Tóibín retold from an unfamiliar perspective, that of an embittered Mary, a story most familiar of the rise, the fall, and the rise again of Christ. His boldness came in the tale itself as well as in the manner of its telling. And last week we had the sizable fortune of hosting Kieran Carson and his wife Deirdre. They made traditional Irish airs sound new, in between readings of Kieran's poems and impressive translations. Kieran's ability to move seamlessly from song to talk, from fiddle to phoneme, carrying the flavor of one to the other, introduced another element of voice into the program. This week, our pleasure is twofold. We will begin with a brief performance by BU's only Irish student cultural organization, STEP About Boston. They perform in honor of Jane Richard, who's been dancing for 4 years, since the age of 3. Our featured reader this evening is Paul Muldoon, whose ways of hearing and recording what we say to each other show us how powerful close listening can be. He is a resuscitator not just of language, but also of sound. Fragments of rhythm and rhyme echo between poems, and even between volumes of poems, teaching us his language. This is in itself a way of keeping those things in circulation, and if necessary, can also be an act of reparation. His poetry itself is a form of lively resistance, even if the subject is not resilience in dark hours, in dark times. When the subject of one of Muldoon's poems, The Hedgehog, is clinched into a ball of distrust, what is slyly implied without being said is that language can uncurl in the light of trust and be open. He writes, "We forget the God under this crown of thorns. We forget that never again will a God trust in the world." Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. Thank you. My name is Joe Rezick. I am an assistant professor of English here at BU, and I'm honored to introduce the poet and critic Dan Chiasson, who will then introduce our speaker, Paul Muldoon, and after the reading, we'll lead a conversation with Muldoon that we hope the audience will participate in. BU has been lucky in recent years to welcome Dan Chiasson as a visiting professor of poetry in our creative writing program, and he's also associate professor of English and creative writing at Wellesley College. Currently the poetry critic at The New Yorker and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and many other periodicals, Chiasson is one of the most influential writers and arbiters of taste in our current literary landscape. A winner of many awards, including a Guggenheim, Chiasson has published 3 books of poetry that are at once richly and deeply literary, beautiful, and playful. He published the first of these, The Afterlife of Objects, just after The New Yorker named him a debut poet in 2001. 2 books have followed, Natural History in 2005, and Where's the Moon, There's the Moon in 2009. We are delighted to welcome him as the moderator of our conversation tonight with Paul Muldoon, about whom I would like to say just a word before I turn over the microphone to Dan. I first saw Muldoon read his poetry about a dozen years ago when I was an undergraduate at Columbia University. The reading was brought to my attention by a professor of mine who I hold entirely responsible for my taste and interest in contemporary poetry, the late and legendary Kenneth Koch. The course I was taking with Koch focused on the mystery and mechanics of poetic form, and he spoke highly of Muldoon as a practitioner. If possible tonight, I'd like to issue a belated thanks to Professor Koch for introducing me to Muldoon's work, and now to Dan Chiasson in advance for introducing him to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go, dancers. That was unbelievable, spectacular. It's very moving. I'm almost speechless. We're all feeling so heavy of tread right now, and to hear and see them do their thing is amazing. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Meg, Sven, all sponsors and people who've had anything to do, Elizabeth, Vivian. It's just great to be here and to have Paul Muldoon here. Seeing him in the hallway just now is the first time I think I've been happy in the last 72 hours. So it's remarkable to have you here. I'm going to speak fairly personally about my admiration for Paul Muldoon's work. This week and these events have made me feel like it's important to reassert personhood any way we can. Anyway, this is what I prepared to say. I never made much of a distinction between the poems and poets I loved and the songs and bands I loved, which made the idea that some poets were difficult to understand, that difficulty was something to be grappled with, defended, attacked, itself, to me, a difficult idea. And so I had no difficulty with the undeniably difficult work of Paul Muldoon when at 17 I first picked it up. Nothing, after all, could have been more difficult than Dylan's Desolation Row, which, as though making my point for me, first introduced me to the names T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, those exemplars of modernist difficulty whose work I have memorized even when I don't understand it. The point wasn't to get it, the point was to listen and to love it. Ditto for Muldoon. He was a force, plain and simple, as he is now more than ever. His poems, compacted with odd words and place names and proper names, intentional misprints and misprisions, were tuned ineffably to the great lyrics of the past, to his beloved Frost and Thomas and Hausman, and farther back into the bloodstream and DNA of poetry to the anonymous lyrics of the 13th and 14th century. You hear all of it in Muldoon's poems, whatever shock the surface offers. Feats of association was Frost's phrase for the kind of thing I mean. If such feats don't thrill us, they don't and won't matter. How do we get from Yeats to Reykjavik to Chester Kalman in the following lines from 7 Midda Street, one of the poems that I picked up when I was 17 and that blew my mind. Beats me, but have you ever heard anything so thrilling? Both beautiful, one a gazebo. When Hart Crane fell from the Orizaba, it was into the true Normand of the well of Carrickfergus Castle, all very Ovidian, as the ghostly Helfdane once remarked of both sorts of kipper we were forced to eat at supper every night in Reykjavik. One tasted of toenails, one of the thick skin on the soles of the feet. He now affects an ulster lined with koipu and sachets like an albino rabbit down the same Fifth Avenue, where Avida dollars once squired an ocelot on a solid gold chain snaffled from Bonwit tellers. It seems that Scott Fitzgerald wrote Ivanhoe, or the Rubaiyat, and Chester Kalman equals agape. At last, or at AGAPE, may be agape, or it may be agape, I really don't know. Kalman was notorious, famous for his astounding fellatio technique. The word in Greek means practically the opposite of erotic love. It means brotherly love. Again, I don't know what to make of it. The force of it took me by the neck, and it's never left me behind. The passage laid out for me at 17 a formidable curriculum, Yeats and Crane and Beowulf and Lewis MacNeice and Brooklyn and Iceland and Calvados. All of it would have to be sampled, but none of it could account for the power of that passage. Muldoon has been writing poems with the vigor and swagger of rock lyrics for so long, it was only a matter of time before he would publish a volume of rock lyrics that work as great poems. I hope, he'll read a little from his new volume called The Word on the Street, lyrics written for his, I hate to try to characterize the band, they're so haunting and beautiful, but I would say sort of indie folk band, the Wayside Shrines, www.waysideshrines.org. I spent the afternoon listening to the record. It's very beautiful. This is the part of the introduction when I would tell you that Paul Muldoon is the recipient of many prizes and awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Moist Sand and Gravel, where for me one of the great long poems of the 21st century resides, namely At the Sign of the Black Cross, or that he is Howard G.B. Clark 21 professor at Princeton University, or that he is poetry editor of The New Yorker. I would tell you those things if it weren't simply more accurate to say that he is the crucial English language poet born since 1950, without whom nothing. The mainstream of English eddies in and rushes through his work. Paul Muldoon.
Brilliant. What a wonderful introduction. How are y'all? You know, it's 6:30. What I thought I'd do would be to read a few poems, and for perhaps 20 minutes, 30 minutes,
right,
something like that, and then we'll have an opportunity for a discussion, which I hope you'll be able to join in.
On.
Has that just come on? Are you okay? You all set? Can you hear me okay? Put up a hand if I fade. So where to begin? You know, I'm going to begin, if I may, with an image of dancers. And they come from a poem called Dancers at the Moy. And the Moy is the name of a little village on the Armagh-Tyrone border, about halfway across Northern Ireland, where I was brought up. And it was a village that was reputedly founded by a man called James Caulfield, the Earl of Charlemont, who, like many as a young fella in the 18th century, had been on a grand tour of Europe and came across a little town called Marengo. as in chicken Marengo, for those of you who are the bon vivant among you. And those of you who are followers of Napoleon will remember, of which there are a few, I'm sure, will remember that it was the name of Napoleon's horse, Marengo. Marengo, come over. Anyway, we of course knew the town or the village of the Moy as the site of a horse fair, where indeed buyers came from all over Europe to buy horses for the cavalries of Europe. And until, in fact, sometime in or around 1921-22, during one of the Greek-Turkish campaigns, when a deputation of Greek army buyers came over to the Moy to buy horses for the cavalry, and everyone round about basically had anything that looked even remotely like a horse, brought it into town, and a local family who specialized in horse dealing bought up the horses. The only problem was that things went wrong for the Greeks, and they did not come back to collect the horses. And this signaled an economic crash for this little village. Things were really not the same after it. And I suppose that if this poem is about anything, quote unquote, about anything, one might say that it is about our capacity to rise above what is sent to challenge us. Dancers at the Moy. This Italian square and circling plain, black once with mares and their stallions, the flat black water turning its stones over hour after hour, as their hooves shone and lifted together under the black rain. One or other Greek war now coloured the town blacker than ever before, with hungry stallions and their hungry mares like hammocks of skin. The flat black water unable to contain itself as horses poured over acres of grain in a black and gold river. No band of Athenians arrived at the Moy Fair to buy for their campaign. Peace having been declared and a treaty signed, the black and gold river ended as a trickle of brown, where those horses tore at briars and whins, ate the flesh of each other like people in famine. The flat black water hobbled on its stones with a wild stagger and sag in its backbone. The local people gathered the white skeletons. Horses buried for years under the foundations give their earthen floors the ease of trampolines. To give them a little buoyancy. You know, I'm going to refer to an instance of contemporary famine in contemporary Africa in this next poem, which is a poem set in New Jersey, where I've lived for about 25 years, having lived for the first 35 in Ireland, mostly in Belfast. So this is a poem set in the house we live in down in New Jersey, a house built largely in 1750, and of course in that part of the world, as in this one, in that era, when they were building a house, they were sure to incorporate as much horsehair into the plaster as they possibly could. And so the poem refers to that as it goes along. In the 1830s, a bunch of Irish guys came, I don't know about dancing, but they came slowly down the road. They were involved in the building of the Delaware and Raritan Canal, one of the great canals from that era of canal building. There are descriptions of them with their insteps bound with rags, bloody rags, from the severity of the work of digging this canal with a spade. Many of them died in the process. Some of them died from cholera. There were a few major cholera pandemics at the time, as you may recall. In any case, this is a poem having to do with a series of sensations through a hole in a wall in this house. It has a little refrain, which, like many's a refrain in songs and poems, is on the borderline between sense and nonsense. The loaf. When I put my finger to the hole, they've cut for a dimmer switch. In a wall of plaster stiffened with horsehair, it seems I've scratched a 200-year-old itch with a pink and a pink and a pinky pick. When I put my ear to the hole, I'm suddenly aware of spades and shovels turning up the gain, all the way from Raritan to the Delaware, with a clink and a clink and a clinky click. When I put my nose to the hole, I smell the floodplain off the canal after a hurricane and the spots of green grass where thousands of Irish have lain, with a stink and a stink and a stinky stick. When I put my eye to the hole, I see one holding horse dung to the rain, in the hope, indeed, of washing out a few whole ears of grain, with a wink and a wink and a winky wick. And when I do at last succeed in putting my mouth to the horsehair fringed niche, I can taste the small loaf of bread he baked from that whole seed, with a link and a link and a linky lick. So let me just move away from that for a moment and give you a little song lyric. This is from this book that you so kindly commented on, The Word on the Street. I've been interested for a long time in trying to write songs. Not that one's doing anything other than trying to write poems. But anyway, I'm fascinated by the business of attempting to do it. So let me see what would be one to do. Let me just do this one first. It's called Come Back. I went to see the other night. I found myself at yet another concert by Fleetwood Mac. Do you remember them? Come Back. So, we were introduced by Bruce at the Stone Pony. all that concentrated juice, standing room only. You were with some suit from EMI or Sony who was so full of toot he called for Moni Moni. You came back to the slum, the squat with Lars and Sammy. Then Lanois Green Thumb grew us a golden Grammy. And then our double album hit a double whammy. When it reached #1, we reached for our Swami to make a comeback. A comeback, don't you see? It's time to come back. Come back to me. Then our master's voice told us it was cool to park the Rolls Royce in the swimming pool, while our drugs of choice were run from Istanbul through a girl called Joyce, whose real name was Mule. We loved the paparazzi flash, the paparazzi zoom. When we finished our stash of magic mushrooms, we'd pay in cash for a kilo of Khartoum and come back to trash another hotel room. Making a comeback. A comeback, don't you see? It's time to come back. Come back to me. When we broke up, we swore we'd never kiss and tell, never speak to each other until hell freezes over, or whatever hell does when it's co-produced by Eno and Woz. But behind the music and where they now have pointed the way, they've shown us how to take a leaf from Plant and Page and Fleetwood Mac and set the stage for a comeback. A comeback, don't you see? It's time to come back, baby. Come back to me. We'd no sooner said farewell than it was time to reunite. A flame's likelier to dwell in a diminished light. For though we're a hard sell, what with the cellulite, we're still clear as a bell, we're still pretty tight. So let's remember the fans as we fan the embers and hit the meadowlands this coming September. When we take each other's hands, baby, let's remember we're just another band with only 2 surviving members. Making a comeback from yet another rave. A comeback, baby. A comeback from the grave. So, let me see. Yes, we'll do a little... this is called It Won't Ring True. It Won't Ring True. How are you all doing? You okay? It won't ring true. Once your spray tan and my fake ID would take us anywhere we needed to be in this world or the next. Now I've set aside my feelings for the pain you've been revealing in your most recent text. Can you see how up to date this stuff is? My pride is hard to swallow and my promise overdue. But if a promise isn't hollow, you know it won't ring true. Your idea that I might take a plane through sleet and freezing rain is so vacuous. Don't forget the whopper Buddy told the Big Bopper about getting off the bus. Buddy had played the Apollo to victorious reviews. But if a victory isn't hollow, you know it won't ring true. You said I was talking hot air, I was talking through my hat. I was striking the wrong chord. I was either sharp or flat. Someday I'll hit the right note on a Martin D42. If a guitar isn't hollow, you know it won't ring true. Once my fake ID and your spray tan were all we had in our retirement plan, then you headed for the hills. There's a chance you'll reconsider and go with the lowest bidder and bend to my will. I never said I'd follow, is my excuse to you. But if an excuse isn't hollow, you know it won't ring true. That's yes. So let me go back and, what was I going to do? I read, yes. Sorry, yes, there it is. You know, I'm going to read an elegy, what turned out to be an elegy for my sister who died 8 years ago of ovarian cancer at an early age. Just as my mother had died of it at an early age. And this has a, you know, hard to stand up and read poems in this town and in this week, in any town, in any week perhaps. But I don't want to, not to somehow address the elegiac tone that hangs over the town. You know, you mentioned the lovely Colm Tobin, who was here the other day, is that right? The other month. I went to see Colm's play. I don't know if any of you have seen it, the Testament of Mary. And I was quite upset by it, not by the content necessarily, but by one of the actors, one of the main protagonists on the stage. Did you see this? So here's the thing. Fiona Shaw, who's absolutely fabulous, of course, as Mary, probably thinks that she's in a one-woman show. And she sort of overlooks, I think, as do most others, the fact that there's a vulture on stage, a live vulture, which I'm pretty sure thinks it's in a one-vulture show. The thing about this vulture, who's known rather dismissively as Pinhead in any reports, Colm wrote a piece for the New York Times about the vulture. He mentioned the vulture's name being Pinhead, which I thought was really inappropriate. I mentioned this to them, by the way. I'm not saying anything to you I wouldn't say to them, or haven't. And, you know, the vulture didn't get was not credited at all in the playbill, no mention whatsoever. Anyway, so it was troubling for that reason. Turkey buzzards. They've been so long above it all. Those two petals, so steeped in style, they seem to stall in the kettle, simmering over the town dump. Or better still, the neon-flashed, X-rated rump of fresh roadkill, courtesy of the interstate that Eisenhower would overtake in the home straight by 1 horsepower. The kettle where it all boils down to the thick scent of death. A scent of such renown it's given vent to the idea buzzards can spot a deer carcass a mile away, smelling the rot as once Marcus Aurelius wrinkled his nose at a gas leak from the great sewer that ran through Rome to the Tiber. Then went searching out through the gloam, one subscriber to the other view, that the rose, full-blown, antique, its no frills rough, the 6-foot shrug of its swing wings, the theologians and the thugs twin triumphings, in a buzzard's shaved head and snood, buzz, buzz, buzzy. Its logic, in all likelihood somewhat fuzzy, would ever come into focus, it ever deign to dispense its hocus pocus in that same vein as runs along an inner thigh, to where, too right, the buzzard vouchsafes not to shy away from shite, its mission not to give a miss to a bête noire, all roly-poly, full of piss and vinegar, trying rather to get to grips with the grommet of the gut, setting its tin snips to that grommet in the spray-painted hind gut, and making a sweeping cut that's so blasé, it's hard to imagine, dear sis, why others shrink from this sight of a soul in bliss, so in the pink from another month in the red of the shambles, like a rose in over its head among brambles. Unflappable in its belief, its Ararat on which the ark would come to grief, abjuring that Marcus Aurelius humbug about what springs from earth, succumbing to the tug at its heartstrings, reported to live past 50, as you yet may, dear sis. Perhaps growing your hair in requital, though briefly, of whatever tears at your vitals, learning perhaps from the nifty, nay, thrifty way these buzzards are given to stoop and take their ease by letting their time-chastened poop fall to their knees till they're almost as bright with lime as their night roost. Their poop containing an enzyme that's known to boost their immune systems, should they prong themselves on small bones round a cerebral cortex, at no small cost to their well-being, sinking fast in a dear crypt. Buzzards getting the hang at last of being stripped of their command of the vortex while having lost their common touch. They've been so long above it all. Perhaps a little song just to vary the mood a little bit. This one's called Elephant Anthem. I mentioned the Vineland Drive-In here. That's the Vineland Movie Theatre, drive-in movie theatre, rather than a drive-in restaurant in this case. Sorry? So, Elephant Anthem. Elephant Anthem. Well, we knew the world was crying out for a song called Elephant Anthem. The elephants of Donnybunk. They've left on the late train, for when it comes to packing trunks, they're speedy in the main. And when it comes to skipping town, the elephants have got it down to a fine art. They too refuse to act their age, and when they go on the rampage, they're off the chart. They still rely quite heavily on scent for figuring out what it all meant. The elephants know project teams are good for rolling logs. You think I'm pushy and I seem to treat people like cogs. Because push always comes to shove, the elephants go hand in glove in single file. When the dust settled on our show, you had me thinking you might go the extra mile to where we'd find a spot to pitch our tent and figure out what it all meant. The elephants are less disposed to hard work now they've found the Vineland Drive-In will stay closed until the spring comes around. The Vineland Drive-In has 2 screens where everything we've ever seen was at a slant. The elephants take in both sides as each projects on its own hide an elephant. They also see how little time we've spent in figuring out what it all meant. Would this be a good moment for a little chat, or and then maybe I'll come back and read another one or two or whatever? How do you feel? Before we have a chat? Okay, you've talked me into it. Thank you. What did we say? You know, go back and read that one that someone referred to, the hedgehog poem. It was one of the first poems I wrote. When I was a kid, in Ireland, there was a hedgehog that came round to our back door every night in the winter time. And hedgehogs are not part of the landscape here, of course. At least they're not native to this part of the world. There are a few hedgehogs around, obviously. Well, I don't know about obviously. There are a few hedgehogs around, but they've been imported. You know, of course, like many's another thing. The starling, for example. Sorry? Have you seen a hedgehog?
Someone was asserting that we have them.
Do we have hedgehogs?
So.
Have we really? That rings a bell, but that's a different thing. That's a different thing. You know, the woodchuck, also known as the groundhog. You know, no, not at all. Now, when I was a kid, I had a problem in the other direction. Well, I had a few problems, but I had a problem in this direction with the groundhog, because the only thing I knew about a groundhog was from Richard Eberhardt's famous poem, "The Groundhog," which some of you perhaps know, which ends up with this extraordinary hymn, I suppose one would have to say, this kind of extravagant rhetorical flourish at the end of the poem, where he talks about, I think of something like Alexander in his tent and Saint Teresa in her wild lament, or something like that. Do you remember that? And I assumed, because of the level of the rhetoric, the rhetoric was jacked up like that a groundhog was quite an animal, and that it must in fact be like a wild boar or something, that, it was a very, like a sanglier, some noble animal, which is not, I've got nothing against groundhogs, but I just envisaged one, never having seen one, as been a quite different thing. It's one of these classic cases of of reading a poem and being moved by it and understanding it in some sense without actually understanding it at all. Having no idea of what a groundhog was. I thought it was a wild boar, and that's why I was getting so excited about it. But anyway, so I had to make do with this little hedgehog. Yes, a hedgehog. Excuse me. Do you remember the hovercraft? Do you still have hovercrafts in Boston Harbor? Did you ever have them here? At one time? No? Huh. Because they seem to be the coming thing in the late 1960s, early 70s, the hovercraft. There was just a hovercraft that went between France and England. I don't think we see much of them now.
They were the future.
They were the future, along with the 3-day week.
Right. And the Segway.
Yes. Hedgehog. The snail moves like a hovercraft, held up by a rubber cushion of itself, sharing its secret with the hedgehog. The hedgehog shares its secret with no one. We say, hedgehog, come out of yourself, and we will love you. We mean no harm. We want only to listen to what you have to say. We want your answers to our questions. The hedgehog gives nothing away, keeping itself to itself. We wonder what a hedgehog has to hide, why it so distrusts. We forget the God under this crown of thorns. We forget that never again will a God trust in the world. As I say, I was written when I was maybe 16 or 17, and you sort of have to be 16 or 17 to write a poem like that, with such assurance about how things are. So maybe I'll just finish with a little song or lyric, and okay, this is one called Cleaning Up My Act. And it refers, I suppose, to our capacity in this country to somehow, often enough, to allow for a disconnect between language and what it refers to. I was struck, actually, I hope this doesn't strike you as being slightly strange, strike a wrong note, but I was struck on Monday, immediately after this tragedy here, that one of the first things that was said about it was they were not immediately going to refer to it as an act of terror. And I must say, I thought to myself, why would that be? What else would you call it? Unless perhaps you are so actually accustomed to the idea that things may not be called what they are, where enhanced interrogation is a term we might use, where extraordinary rendition is a term we might use. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about that. I'm going to read you this this little lyric. Cleaning up my act. There are no gentlemen in a gentlemen's club. A direct flight to Reno may stop at a hub. I flagged behind my flagon of Côte du Rhône. You'd passed out on the passion wagon when I asked you home. I told you it's a condo. It's a cold water flat. The tricks I've played are dirty tricks. That's why I'm cleaning up my act. Nothing is a problem to a problem child. Yeah. Though the issue of labeling sends me hog wild, I pick up the plot that thickens around a free-range pig. I check out a fresh chicken to find it's been deep chilled. When did you last hear a kettle call a kettle black? I've been defiled by your sales pitch. That's why I'm cleaning up my act. For I was taken in by the identical twin of a pole dancer from Denver, my oh my. As for her skin, it was barely as thin as the pretext under which she asked me why there are no gentlemen in a gentleman's club. No room for nuclear families in a nuclear sub. A flight may run from Reno to a renal ward. A tall cappuccino turns out to be small. Many's a mass of sugar, sells itself as low fat. I'm hoping to be filthy rich. That's why I'm cleaning up my act. Thank you. Should we go up here? Yeah, please, yes. Thank you.
Is mine on? Hello? People could start to come to the mics, and I have a few flimsy questions to take up some time, but it's really all about what you want to ask, Paul. That was so moving and it's powerful. Thank you. Is this on? You can hear me? Okay, great. In that last poem, I was thinking the president today quoted a line of poetry.
Did he? No, I haven't heard his speech.
Yeah,
I'm
he was
afraid.
here in Boston and he quoted
Oh, I knew
it.
that, but didn't hear what he said. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it didn't ring a bell with me at all. Did anybody catch this, the line of poetry that he quoted? It was not familiar at all. It's something about Boston being a state of grace. And then it turned out the internet found it a few minutes later. It was from an E.B. White poem. You know, E.B. White, yeah.
Mm.
But it was interesting because the president didn't name E.B. White. He just said, as the poet said, Boston is a state of grace. And it struck me that we think of poets as kind of getting it right somehow in these moments. And that drew me to your poem lyric in this book called Badass Blues, where you have T.S. Eliot getting it wrong, as it were. I'll just read the lines. Do you mind if I read these?
No, it's
okay,
all
right, fine. I won't read them as well as you do.
No.
All right. Badass Blues. That's Charlton Heston belching on the set. I guess he likes the stew. That's Charlton Heston belching on the set. Guess he likes the camel stew. Charlton Heston's belching on the set. Arnold Rothstein's welching on a bet. They've got them badass blues. Arnold Rothstein's scored a dirty game in his two-tone wingtip shoes. Arnold Rothstein's scored a dirty game in his two-tone wingtip shoes. Arnold Rothstein scored a dirty game, but T.S. Eliot wore the shirt of flame. They'd got them badass blues. T.S. Eliot simply never dared to capitalize the J in Jew. T.S. Eliot simply never dared to capitalize the J in Jew. T.S. Eliot simply never dared to challenge Albert Einstein's E equals mc squared. Thought they'd both got them badass blues. It goes on in a brilliant way.
It goes on and on.
It goes well, actually, the next line, I have to read the next couple of lines. Albert Einstein looks vaguely like a dog that's sacred to the Hindu. Anyway.
I like that stuff.
I love it. I love
Good,
it.
I'm glad.
Yeah, I'm into it.
You know, yes, I mean, I feel badly about mentioning that about T.S. Eliot, who's one of my favorite poets, and the poet who sort of got me started in many ways. And when I was a teenager, there's something about him that's just so remarkable. I think funnily enough, I was just the other day, I found myself having agreed to write an introduction to a reissue of The Wasteland, which has been done by the press that did it in the first place, Liverwright Press. Having agreed to do it, then I had to do it, I guess. But you know, being reminded again of what an extraordinary poet he was, but he also had some problems.
Was he a figure to resist in Ireland growing up for you? Had fatigue with Eliot already set in at that point? Or?
No, I don't. No, I came to Eliot. Eliot died in about what?
65?
Something like, yes, that's right. And I came to him probably the following year, something like that.
Uh-huh.
I would have been 15 or 16 at the time. So.
Yeah.
No, I loved him, and
Yeah.
And everything I wrote actually was in the style of T.S. Eliot.
Yes.
As was sometimes the case for himself. But anyway, that's another matter. But it was fabulous. So I feel a little bad about that, but what can I do?
It's not the worst thing that's ever been said about
Not the
T.S.
worst
Eliot.
thing that's ever been said about him. No.
But it struck me because as I was writing my little introduction, I was remembering, do you know the song Desolation Row by
Yes.
Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot?
Yes.
I think your song might be the second song that I know to mention Eliot. It raises a question of what you see as the relationship between these two things that are called lyrics, lyric poems, and song lyrics. How do you know you're writing? How do you know you're writing a poem and not a lyric and the other way around?
You know, I'm not sure if I do quite know that. One of the reasons why I became interested in this, and I hope this doesn't sound, I should just say I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. I became interested in it, I think, for what may seem like a strange reason, but which may resonate with some of you, not you as yet, because you're a young fella, if I may say so. But as we continue to attempt to write poems, some of us find that it becomes harder and harder, and yet in a strange way easier and easier to fake it. And I suppose, you know, I didn't, although it may seem, I didn't want to, and I still hope to avoid it, though I'm sure I won't. I want to avoid taking every idea that comes kind of flying by as, heavens above, what an extraordinarily wonderful idea that is. Let's make a poem of it. And I in a strange way, I think some of the things that will work in the song lyric where the pressure per square inch is more often than not a little lower.
Yes.
You know? I mean, I still hope to be able to write a few poems, but I'm also interested in writing these, I suppose what in other contexts might be thought it was maybe light verse. I don't know. That raises a question about what heavy verse is. I don't know the answer yet. I'm just fascinated by what happens when words and music get together, and when actually when that impulse for other people to join in happens. I'm just fascinated by that, and that doesn't really happen so much in most poetry, though I've been reading Yeats again a lot, as I always do, and I was, for a particular reason, about a month ago, and I know I was struck yet again by the extraordinary number of poems that are songs, or if indeed they don't have the word song in the title, they're using all the devices of the song.
Refrains.
Refrains, yes. And I mean, an astonishing percentage.
Yes.
Of his pieces.
Do you
do that?
Do you compose these songs on the guitar, or
no?
No,
I don't. You know, I play about 2 chords on the guitar.
I heard you say you were working up to a third.
That's right. Yeah, so at least I'm consistent. Yeah. No, I'm not a musician, but unfortunately, but I work with a lot of really great musicians, and this band is some great musicians there, and we have a lot of fun writing these songs. So. But I try to write the lyrics.
You write them with the band in mind, or you collaborate with them, or?
Yes. Well, yes, and with some other people too, but mostly with these guys.
Yeah.
I like the adventure of it.
Are there some questions from the audience? We can go on, but there's a microphone there and over there, and I wondered if anybody wanted to ask Paul something. Bonnie Costello.
Yes, how are you?
Thank you for your reading. I really enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
And I hope you won't mind this question, but I thought the context in which you were invited provoked the question.
Yes.
About being Irish and being an Irish, whether you like or resist being identified as an Irish poet. You mentioned Eliot's importance to you, but also Yeats's importance. I hear a lot of Auden in your work, and I'm just curious if how you respond to that label.
Irish poet?
Yes.
I would be delighted to be counted as one. You know?
It doesn't feel narrowing to you in any way, confining to you in any way?
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would...
there's a great line of Irish writers who resist being Irish or resist Irish identity, so I didn't know if you included yourself in that group.
No, not at all. No, that wouldn't be me. And I'm just, would you be thinking of Joyce maybe, or... Joyce may have, in some sense, resisted that, but, is perhaps the most Irish, if there are degrees of Irishness. Beckett. No, I would not resist anything at all.
What about Irish American poet?
Well, that's a slightly, yeah, I mean, no, the Irish American means something slightly different. I mean, I'm sometimes counted as an American poet. I actually I'm surprised that I'd be counted at all. You know, I think that's the strangest thing, that, you know, one tries to write a few poems, and, you know, you mentioned our friend Auden. You know, it's not entirely clear if Auden was an English poet or an American poet. You mentioned Eliot. It's not entirely clear if he's an American poet or an English poet or something, I don't know. You know, and it doesn't really matter. You know, one of the things that I find fascinating, and my friend here, the Irish poet living in America for the moment, Peter Fallon, knows about this. I'm kind of interested in DNA, and one of the discoveries I made recently was that I am significantly 1/16th East Asian.
Did you get swabbed or whatever they do with a
It's a
Q-tip?
very personal
Yeah,
question.
it is a rather.
But
We're
you're
alone.
right, I did get swabbed.
Yeah,
But that-
swabbed blind.
Yeah, sorry, that line comes from a friend of mine met Patrick O'Brien, the seafaring novelist, at a party. And he says to him, he didn't know what to say to him. He said to Mr. O'Brien,
How old are you?
"Where were you born?"
How were you?
And O'Brien looks at him and says, "That's a very personal question." So anyway, it's one of my favorite lines. But anyway, I did get swabbed, yes.
Yeah.
The decks were swabbed.
The decks were swabbed.
But anyway, you know, so that's a long way of saying, I don't think it matters. And one of the great things about poetry is that, you know, there's so many interconnected components. I mean, I know that there's an interdisciplinary component to this evening, but just within the literatures, the traditions themselves, you know, Yeats, whom we mentioned, was very influenced by Whitman. Frost, did somebody mention? You know, Frost had to go to England to get a start with Edward Thomas, who influenced him they influenced each other. Lowell has been a huge influence in Seamus Heaney, for example, among others. And, you know, there's this wonderful crisscrossing of the Atlantic and things coming round, and not only the Atlantic, the Pacific, and world literature, actually. I think probably most people now who are interested in writing at all have a sense of literatures from right around the world, and Japanese literature, and Australian literature, and Chinese literature, you know? It's all part of one thing, I'd say. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I mean, one thing I do find problematic is any notion, partly because of the DNA thing, any notion of national purity, or in that sense, I find nationalism slightly problematic. One of the glories of this country is that it seems to have engendered a form of national pride, which I think for the most part is inclusive, you know, though of a whole range of subdivisions, as it were. So an Irish person, an Irish American will be an American before an Irish American. But I think there are dangers, and particularly even indeed at times like these, of jingoism.
Joe?
Thanks. Is this my even for thanks for a great reading. Paul Muldoon was here before reading from the Testament of Mary.
Yes.
And that was a change for him from, obviously, from being a novelist to creating the embodied experience body more with a song, right? The kind of the way an audience can convene around a refrain, the way it can be performed in a different kind of communal sense on the stage than with lyric poetry that obviously you can read, but that might have a slightly less immediate relationship to the body than on the song.
Possibly. I mean, of course, we know that in many traditions, including the Irish tradition, there was no distinction between the poem and the song in many, many cases, and the lyric poem was performed to the accompaniment of a lyre or a harp or something like that, a guitar, and so. No, this was something I was interested in trying to do, and I'm not sure if I'll even continue to do it. We'll see, but just find myself doing. And maybe something of it, maybe something of the kind of nakedness of it, the directness with which is associated with it may feed back into some of the poems. Certainly I started writing a few operas a few years ago, 20 years ago now, and I think those changed the way I wrote a bit, you know. When you're, you're talking about the famous difficulty, for example, you know, when you're standing out, say, I feel bad, I feel good, I feel terrible, I feel wonderful, the kind of belting it out aspect. May influence things. I honestly don't know. It's conceivable.
If you hear the music on www.waysideshrines.org, it's fantastic. He didn't put me up to this. I spent the whole afternoon listening in bed.
I'm so glad you like
It's
that.
fantastic.
Yeah, because they're great. They're
beautiful
really
singer. She's a very beautiful voice.
We have several wonderful singers.
Yeah.
Yes, they're really great.
But the lyrics are very in the front. I mean, you're not writing. I don't know, when Jagger writes for the Stones, the presumption is that the song is going to be mixed such that the lyrics will be sort of partially intelligible. It seems to be with every one of these songs, the lyrics were very much in the front of the song.
You know, the other side of that, of course, is that, you know, I'm sure it is the case that a lot of the time with the Stones and indeed other singers, one doesn't quite know what they're saying.
Right.
It's probably just as well in some cases.
Yeah.
But that's it. What that indicates actually is, in many ways, quite troubling. Which is, if one's interested in the word, which is that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Much about the words. I think that's kind of the.
Yeah.
Well,
these are rock songs, but they remind me of Cole Porter or someone because the verbal turns, the turns of wit, depend on the lyrics being intelligible, totally intelligible, and in the front.
I would be thrilled if I came, what we call in Ireland, within a bagel's gall. What that means is within the call of a hound, a bagel's gall, a bagel's howl, a bagel's gall. To come within a bagel's gall of something, I would love to come within a bagel's gall of Cole Porter, you know, who's a genius, and who, I mean, it's wonderful to see him, for example, included in the Library of America.
Yeah.
I think he is.
Yeah.
You know, he's a great writer, and who cares? I mean, it goes back to the Irish, the American, whatever. Who cares what he is or what we call him or what we call these things, in a way? I mean, the important thing is that, you know, do they have an effect on you? Do they have an impact on you?
You're certainly within a beagle's call and maybe even a bagel's call of Cole Porter.
That'd be nice if it were true.
I was just curious, in thinking about writing songs more, whether you found any affinities between your canon of songwriters and your canon of poets. You know, I mean, is Cole Porter like Dylan Thomas or Howlin' Wolf like T.S. Eliot, or any unusual sort of affinities or echoes that you found in that process of sort of switching over? I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
there are many, many songwriters from right the way through and poets from right the way through whom I love. Songwriters. One of my favorite songwriters, I just got a collection of his books, of his lyrics, edited by his daughter, is Ian Dury.
Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, right?
Yeah.
That song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know Ian Dury and the Blockheads? He was an absolutely fabulous songwriter, Cockney.
Do you have Spotify, Paul? I feel like I'm advertising. I'm here to advertise.
I don't have Spotify.
Yeah.
No, I can barely know how to turn off my phone. In fact,
There are
I'm
other
not-
services like it, but one can hear anything one wants at the touch of a button for
Right.
a very small fee per month.
Yeah.
Spotify.com.
Ian Dury and the Blockheads, fabulous band if you don't know them.
Great band.
Hit me with your rhythm stick. I don't know what that means, but
Please.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
yes?
Yeah.
Mr. Muldoon, I've read your poetry for a long time and loved it, but I've never seen a picture of you. And the whole time you were speaking tonight, I couldn't stop thinking of Stephen Rea.
Of who?
Do you know Stephen Rea?
Stephen Ray.
Yeah.
I do, yes.
Right? That you look so much like him.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that maybe, and you both have an interest in sort of the poetics of sound and music, that maybe you should collaborate on a film for your next project.
You should get swabbed again.
Yeah. Yeah, get what?
Get swabbed. Maybe you're 1/8 Stephen Ray.
Stephen, funnily enough, I hope he won't mind my mentioning this if you broadcast this, but funny enough, Stephen was thinking of doing a show with some of these lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, he's fabulous. He's so brilliant. I
Yeah.
don't think anything has come of it. It was going to be, I think, at one point some sort of one-person show, but nothing has come of it. But he is brilliant.
But I think it would be a nice interchange.
The hair, I can't say anything much about. I did get my hair cut this morning in Boston,
Here in Boston.
and there's often more of it than there is right now.
Looks great. Holding steady. Mine's creeping up the head. And we have, I think for one more, we go. Okay, one more question.
This gentleman.
There's a long tradition in British and American poetry of poets visiting the graves of other poets and writing poetry. So I'm wondering if you have visited any poets' graves and written poetry about that. And secondly, if you've written your own epitaph.
That's a fantastic question.
Do you think so?
I do, yeah.
You think that's a great
I
question?
it's a great question.
Maybe you should take it.
Well, have you visited Lowell's grave in New Hampshire?
I have not.
Yeah.
Where is it?
It's in Dunbarton, New Hampshire.
Dunbarton,
You can pull off the road. It's by St. Paul's School.
Yeah,
And then you
no-
go down Route 13, and they moved it at one point. He writes about that.
No, I
because it was
visited a few graves, absolutely. I was one of the ways in which we amused ourselves, actually, as in the country, in Ireland, was by grave visiting. And am I right or am I wrong?
No, you're right. My mother mentions that.
Yeah, good. Well, I thank heaven somebody's going to corroborate me. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It was a favorite pastime. So I have been to a few graves, absolutely. You know, I haven't written, I have actually suggested to I have thought of an epitaph for myself. It is stand to one side. So anyway, it's something I said to my son, and I think he said that should be on your grave, and I said maybe it should.
Lowell's.
Yeah.
I was just going to say Lowell's is the immortal is scraped unconsenting from the mortal.
Yeah. I think
Go
it's
on.
somehow a bit self-regarding to think of one's own epitaph, I'd say, except maybe in a slightly wry way, humorous way.
Thank you, Paul. This has been spectacular, and thank all of you.
Thank you very much.